Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters. This is Reverend Larry Camp, the pastor of the Bethlehem Baptist Church in the East New York section of Brooklyn, which we affectionately call the Bethlehem Nation. Again, we're so glad that you have tuned in to Insight. Insight, of course, is a program that has been designed to speak of social issues, political, certainly theological, as it relates to our system of education, school boards, and various things like that concern us. So we're so glad to have you on tonight. I want you to know that Congressman Hakeem Jeffries is with us, and I want to be respectful of his time because I know he has a lot to do, and a lot to do earlier, certainly on today and this evening. So we're certainly glad to welcome him here. Not only is Hakeem Jeffries certainly the Democratic Caucus chair, but he serves in the 8th District, which includes, of course, our congregation, and the fact that he is a member of the Cornerstone Baptist Church, where my friend, the Reverend Lawrence Aker, serves as pastor. Congressman Jeffries, it's so good to have you on this evening.
Pastor Camp, it's a blessing to be on with you and Bethlehem Nation. And, as always, just so thankful for you and for your leadership and your support and your spirit and all you do for the church and for the community.
I think it's a wonderful time to have you on, Congressman, particularly leading up to the days of election as it relates to voting, early voting, and how that entails. Because I know that your word would be to be able to accomplish that, get the word out, and to, by all means, go and to cast your vote. But what I want to say, Congressman, is that as much as people, when they look at the election, they're primarily looking at the presidential election, not realizing in some cases how important the local election is. And the reason why I bring that up is that we used to have, of course, we had states' rights in this country for many, many years. But how important would you articulate and emphasize the local election being just as important as the presidential election?
Yeah, it's a great question. And we see, explosive turnout generally every 4 years. And sometimes people will come in and they'll just vote at the presidential level and won't even go down to the congressional level, let alone the state legislative level. But the way in which, as you indicated, Pastor Camp, our system of government has been divided, what they call federalism. You've got local government, you've got state government, and you've got the federal government. And even if you have a president who shares your values, what we found out during the last 6 years of the Obama administration is that once we lost that House in 2010, they were intent on doing nothing but obstructing President Obama's agenda. And so it's important to make sure that you vote for people who share your values at every single level. Now, we've got early voting, which has been a success. The lines have been very long, and we've got to work to get that right moving forward. But I'd rather see longer lines than no lines, because it means our people are engaged. But for years, New York State, which is widely viewed as one of the most progressive states in the country, had no early voting because the state Senate was in Republican hands, and they just didn't want people to be able to vote more easily than they had been. And it wasn't until the state Senate recently changed hands as a result of the 2018 election that Democrats, led by a state senator from Brooklyn, Zelnor Myrie, were able to pass a law that allowed for early voting in the state of New York. That's just one of many examples of, what can be done when you send people into office who share your values, because elections are managed at the state and local level. And it wasn't something that President Obama could change or that Congress could even change, but could be done at the state level. And there are just so many examples beyond voting that fall into that category that directly impact our quality of life.
My family has always been a voting family. My mom used to work for, she used to volunteer for him, Albert Lowenstein. Albert Lowenstein was one of the, in the area that I grew up in, which was Williamsburg. Albert Lowenstein was very effective, certainly in the area, but people don't realize that how close Albert Lowenstein was to the late Robert F. Kennedy, and he was killed in front of his office. Of course, there are those who speculate, because it had been said historically that he was about to had information in regards to Robert Kennedy's assassination that he was going to bring to the country. So my mother worked with a local elected official because she felt that was important. She was affected. She was also felt it was important for us to exercise that vote. My children, who are all grown, all vote, but it was the first time that we voted together in one unit. When President Barack Obama, when he became president of the United States, and I think that was very effective. Now, after you've talked about how important that is, Justice Amy Coney Barrett. Now, I only know what I read. Mr. Congressman, what exactly is her stance? And I don't want to judge her prematurely, other than other people's opinion of her. But exactly where does she stand as it relates to being the Supreme Court Justice, and how would she in some way affect or distract the nation itself?
Well, I think, the rush to put her on the bench was incredibly calculated and diabolical in nature, if you will. This is the same group that refused to even give the election year nomination of Barack Obama a hearing. And that was a nomination that was made after a Supreme Court justice died in February, 8 or 9 months before the election, not a few weeks before the election. But of course, they wanted to take that Supreme Court seat away from Barack Obama, and they stole that one. And then they came around with a different standard, reversing their position in its entirety to try to jam Amy Coney Barrett down the throats of the American people, because they believe her to be an extreme right-wing judge who will now be a justice, who may in fact vote to try to take our health care away. Because a week after the election, on Tuesday, November 10th, the Supreme Court is scheduled to hear the latest challenge to the constitutionality of the Affordable Care Act. They've already ruled it's constitutional twice, but these folks are so obsessed with taking down one of Barack Obama's signature accomplishments that they've come up with another legal theory to try to unravel the Affordable Care Act. And we believe that they were rushing to put her on the bench so that she could be seated during that oral argument, because in order to rule on a case, you have to be seated and hear the oral argument. And now we'll see what happens, in terms of healthcare, but we believe that she could be a no vote in the context of the constitutionality of the Affordable Care Act. She's likely to be a no vote as it relates to voting rights protections, the no vote on gun safety. And though she claims to be an originalist, and I don't really even, the notion of being an originalist, it's 240 years later. The Constitution should be a living document.
Yeah, exactly.
That's just an excuse for saying we want to strike down laws that Congress passes that we don't agree with. That's our view of the situation. Now, we're going to have to deal with this appointment after the fact and figuring out what we're going to do with possible judicial reform. But I've said to people, we got to win first, because we can't reform a thing if we don't win the presidency, the House, and the Senate.
Well, to say that for her to say she's an originalist is almost like a code word by saying we're the originals, or I follow exclusively the words and the creeds of the founding fathers. But the founding fathers, what they put together is clear. And even that is about to be, or the attempt is to make it unclear. And certainly it looks like as if we have to be so careful that the country is not taken in a way where it resembles. I've said, Congressman Jeffries, and I still do believe in this, that the similarities between what's going on now in Nazi Germany is very, very close. It's very close in terms of people's jobs and in terms of those who own jobs and their communities. With that being said, is democracy as we know it diminishing?
Yeah, no, listen, I mean, I think that we've got every reason to believe that if this president were reelected, we would be closer to authoritarianism as we've ever been. Now, I think that the way I've looked at this presidency is that we in America are in a third backlash moment. And that every time we've made progress in America, there's always been a backlash. And we were an imperfect country. You know, we're a great country. We've come a long way. We still have a long way to go, but we were a flawed country, going back to the original nature, right? Which is why I think you and I and others, we find it so problematic to suggest that, because at the same time, while there were all these high ideals, you know, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equally and entitled to life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. But at the same time, you had chattel slavery, one of the worst crimes in the history of the world. Now, that was, you know, what I like to say is our birth defect. We had a genetic imperfection in America around the question of race, and we've been dealing with it ever since. Now, we made progress, emancipation, the Reconstruction era, 13 years, prohibiting slavery, the 13th Amendment, equal protection under the law, the 14th Amendment, the right to vote regardless of race, the 15th Amendment. But then, as you know, Pastor Camp, the North pulls out of the South and Jim Crow descends on the land. For almost 100 years, the KKK rises up. We see a lynching epidemic. Supreme Court decides Plessy versus Ferguson, which basically says that separate and unequal is constitutional. This lasts for almost 100 years. Then a new generation of change agents arise, Rosa Parks, Dr. King, John Lewis, others, and we see progress again. You know, the 64 Civil Rights Act strikes a blow against Jim Crow. The 65 Voting Rights Act brings the right to vote to life, Medicare, Medicaid, Great Society, Fair Housing Act, and then boom, 68, another moment of backlash. Nixon runs on this so-called law and order campaign slogan, trying to capitalize on the backlash to the progress that had just been made in many parts of America. And then he wins and ushers in a new era, anti-government, anti-busing, anti-affirmative action, and the rise of mass incarceration, which started on his watch in 1971. And then finally, the third moment of progress, the election of Barack Obama, a historic moment. We go from the outhouse to the White House. But there were some folks who said, we're now in a post-racial America. I think y'all remember that.
Yeah.
Post-racial America lasted about 2 years because then you had the Tea Party rise up talking about we want our country back. Who took your country away? They're just angry that a black man got elected. Then the Supreme Court in 2013 strikes a blow against the 65 Voting Rights Act, ushers in this new era of voter suppression, and then the backlash moment is complete in 2016 with the election of Donald Trump. Third backlash moment in America. But I remain hopeful because every time we've been in a backlash moment, a new generation of Americans rise up to say, nope, we're going to continue our march toward a more perfect union. And I'm hopeful that that's what we're going to see over the next few days.
That is certainly hopeful over the course of time and the course of years. Harriet Tubman was interviewed, I believe it was in 1903, and the question was asked of her, how does it feel to now be this free American? And her response to the reporter at that time is that my people have spilled more blood on this soil, which makes me more American than you. Now, of course, she was speaking in the context of what she witnessed and what she came from.
Yeah.
And those words are so true. it is not to disregard anyone else who lives in this country, anyone of a particular background, nothing like that. But I think Harriet Tubman, that response was very, very, very powerful. Now, how do you see with all of this, because you mentioned about, healthcare and particularly our educational system, because we don't know where that's going. Or at least I don't know where that's going at this point, Congressman, and opening, whether they should stay open, whether they should close. What's going to be the effect of this as time goes on? And I don't mean in the next 6 months, but we're really talking about in years from now.
Yeah, I mean, we really are going to have to be intentional about ensuring that this disruptive period with the education of our children doesn't set back, communities that were already at a disadvantage even further. And it by its very nature is disruptive. If you were used to being in a classroom and all of a sudden you've got to go virtual, and what we know is that many of our children, don't have the access to high-speed internet or didn't have the equipment necessary. Now, the city has tried to do the best it can to provide every single person, with an iPad or a laptop. And we've worked hard at the congressional level to provide the city and the state with the resources needed to be able to do that. But we're going to have to do much more as we emerge from this COVID-19 pandemic. We can't simply say everything is back to normal, because there is no back to normal. There's trauma that people have experienced. There's, the inability to process information and to learn in the way that children learn the best, in the classroom setting, in a collaborative fashion. And so I think we're going to have to be intentional about pouring more, everything we've got, from an attention standpoint and from a resource standpoint, particularly into traditionally disadvantaged, undereducated communities. If we were undereducated prior to COVID-19, we're at risk of being set back even more. And that's one of the reasons why in negotiating a new COVID-19 package, we've held the line on ensuring that we invest in state and local governments, because if you disinvest, then they're going to disinvest in the public education of our children, and things won't get better, they'll get worse.
Now, Congressman, I have a woman in my congregation who travels at least 4 times out of the year, and a tremendous disciple of our church, great supporter. And now, when I talked to her about 2 weeks ago, just to check on her to see how she's doing, because I know how she loves to travel, and she travels a lot. When you have people like her and others who travel extensively, what could that possibly do to them in terms of not traveling, or how it affects them emotionally, or how it affects them psychologically? Now, I know you're not a psychologist, Congressman, but that's some of the things that we have to look at as well. People who are used to traveling or moving around are not being able to do that.
Yeah, no, I mean, the adverse impact on sort of the socialization in different forms, even within the family setting, or within the neighborhood and community setting, within the church setting, or in just being able to travel and do the types of things that, provide joy and represent some continuity as you move along your life's journey, and not being able to have any of that, it's complicated. And then to have a president who's got no empathy, zero empathy. I mean, he's on the campaign trail saying COVID, 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 as if it's just a game. It's just extraordinary. A Hollywood screenwriter couldn't make this up. But I think that's why having someone fundamentally who is decent. Now, there may be areas of agreement with Joe Biden. There may be areas of disagreement. I'm certainly glad that he selected Senator Harris to be his partner.
Yes.
But no one can disagree that he's not a fundamentally good person who's experienced adversity in his own life, with the loss of his wife and the loss of his child in a car accident that was horrific as he was on his way into being sworn in to the Senate, and then losing, his son, Bo, to brain cancer, I believe, at an incredibly young age. And so he's experienced the trials and tribulations of life in a real way. And I think having a leader like that, who is going to be empathetic to the trials and tribulations that all of us have experienced in different ways as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, is exactly what we need to, as he said, build back better, which is, I think, what we're gonna want to do. We, in the House side of the equation, we talk about
Yeah.
we
Yeah.
fight for the people, and Joe Biden's talking about build back better. I think we can combine that. You know, we're going to build back better for the people. That's the Hakeem Jeffries remix.
Yes, that sounds good. The when we talk about President Trump, I've always said to my daughters and to members of my congregation that if someone becomes president, you always have to watch who they surround themselves with. There's a saying that I have given to our congregation that a leader is only as good to those who the Lord surrounds them with. Can the president be that unaware, or those that are surrounding him are probably just as not informed or refuse to want to inform him of anything? Or is he not a listening president, or is it the people around him? Of course, I've read about the standstill that took place with John Kennedy and the Russians and things of that nature. I just happened to watch the movie the other day, 13 Days, and really it was about the administration and how they all came together, even though they had their disagreements, to be able to, because this affected the entire country. Who's around him? I mean, we know about the McConnells, but I'm talking about his administration. Who's around him that would not have him to think otherwise, or certainly more broadly, or certainly more intellectually?
Yeah, it's very interesting because initially he had some, patriotic people who were around him. General Mattis, comes to mind. And
Yeah.
at a certain point, they couldn't take it anymore. And what they saw was, just extraordinary. And they've all, in different ways, publicly made that clear that he's a danger. And so, when he initially attempted to bring folks around him who had some degree of professional accomplishment, certainly not everyone was that way. And I don't know what Ben Carson is doing. I mean, that's a disaster. And then Betsy DeVos is a disaster. But I think the whole world revolves around him. And so when you have a figure like that, he doesn't see things through the lens of it takes teamwork to make the dream work. He believes that, as he said publicly, he tells us what he feels sometimes and he speaks the truth. Only I can fix it. That's what he thinks. And that's part of the reason why the whole response to the COVID-19 pandemic has been such an unmitigated disaster. George W. Bush, you may recall, Pastor Camp, used to be
Sure.
criticized as lacking intellectual curiosity. George
Right.
W. Bush makes Trump look like Aristotle.
Yes, he really.
I mean, or Trump makes Bush look like Aristotle, I mean, it's just, the whole thing is crazy. He sits around, watches TV, apparently Fox News. And so we know this because then he live tweets, and he was so angry the other day, apparently, that Fox News was showing Barack Obama's speech live. And we know this is the case because he's tweeting about this, because he's obviously sitting around watching Barack Obama speak.
Yeah.
Yes, Barack Obama is a captivating speaker, but you're the president. Don't you have something that 225,000 Americans have died? But this is what he does all day, every day. And this is what his own people have said. So it's just been a mess. And hopefully we'll all extricate ourselves from that sometime soon.
I think history teaches us so much lessons, as you know more than I do, Congressman, is that you talked about George W. Bush, and Lyndon Johnson will never be known as a great president because of the war in Vietnam, but people may not realize or forget that it's because of Lyndon Johnson why we have PBS today, the arts and things of that nature that are very educational, but he never gets the credit for that, because for him it's the Vietnam War.
Right.
Let me ask you this, Congressman. Is it possible, considering our economy right now, for Democrats and Republicans to work together in a bipartisan, partisan relationship without blind prejudice? Is that possible, that the Democrats and the Republican can work together without blind prejudice as toward their particular goals themselves and
Yeah.
their own policies?
Well, I certainly believe that's the case. And, in 2018, I was able to work in a bipartisan way with a friend and colleague of mine, Doug Collins, who we were on the Judiciary Committee together. And, he was the lead lead Republican sponsor of the First Step Act. That was the criminal justice reform bill that you hear Donald Trump taking credit for and talking a lot about. And I was the lead Democratic sponsor of it. And, we were able to strike a real blow against mass incarceration. Thousands of people have been let out of prison who were there on unjust drug sentences. 90% of the people who have been released have been Black men. We've created additional resources to help people um, effectively reenter society in a way that gives them the job training or the education or the mental health counseling, the substance abuse treatment to be able to become productive members of society. And Republicans were supportive in part because they recognize that if you dramatically reduce recidivism, you save taxpayer dollars. And we were able to pull together a coalition to deal with overcriminalization in America, led by Doug Collins, a conservative Republican from rural Georgia, and little old Hakeem Jeffries, a progressive Democrat from the People's Republic of Brooklyn.
Yeah.
But beyond that, the legislation at the end of the day was supported by the NAACP and the Koch brothers, the ACLU and the Heritage Foundation, the left, the right, progressives, conservatives, Democrats and Republicans, all points in between, and was ultimately signed into law by Donald Trump because he had no choice. The coalition was so broad. And I think, if we can do it on criminal justice reform, which for a long period of time had been a controversial subject to tackle, we can certainly do it as it relates to the economy to make sure that we're providing, a pathway toward allowing everybody in every single zip code access to, the economic opportunities to be able to live a comfortable life. And, from in terms of history, I think Doug Collins and our partnership is the type of partnership that stands on the shoulders of so many others, right? There was Ronald Reagan, who was close with Tip O'Neill.
O'Neill, yes.
Right? Republican president and a Democratic Speaker of the House. And, Senator Ted Kennedy was close with Orrin Hatch, conservative Republican from Utah.
Yeah.
Or Joe Biden, when he was in the Senate, was very close to John McCain, a Democratic and Republican. Ruth Bader Ginsburg, our iconic Supreme Court justice from Brooklyn, the notorious, RBG, was close with Antonin Scalia, the most conservative
that's right.
justice, right, on the Supreme Court when she was the most progressive. And they would regularly travel together. Family would spend time together. They would have dinner together. They were the closest of friends. And so we should be able to work together whenever and wherever possible. And then when we disagree, we can do it without being disagreeable.
Now, let me ask you this, Congressman. This is something I always wanted to ask you. What motivated or inspired you to go into public service?
Yeah, well, it's interesting because I was on my way to graduate school in public policy, and I knew that I wanted to do something in the public policy space to try to make life better for folks. I was unsure, how that would turn out in terms of what I would ultimately do. But as I was on my way to graduate school as a senior at the State University of New York at Binghamton, I come home one night. This was, I think, in late April or early May. And I put the TV on and LA is in flames. And I'm trying to figure out what is going on. It's 1992. And And then I realized what happened was that the verdict in the case against the 4 white officers who had brutally beaten Rodney King, and we caught that on tape, perhaps for the first time, because this was the
Yeah.
for all our millennials, this was the camcorder era. It was very rare that you catch something on tape, and it just so happens that there was a motorist on the other side of the highway who saw something and stopped and caught it on camera. And all of us said, this time will be different, because they didn't believe us that this is what our experiences often are with police officers who cross the line, because they always get the benefit of the doubt. But now they've been caught on tape.
Yeah.
And it turns out that it didn't even matter. And I remember feeling like, you know what, we've come a long way in this country. We still have a long way to go in dealing with these issues of racial and social justice. And not only do I want to go to graduate school, I want to go to law school, and I want to use my law degree in some way, shape, or form to try to advocate on behalf of these communities in central Brooklyn, where I was privileged to grow up. And so as a young lawyer, I ultimately decided, anchored in that desire to want to represent folks,
Yeah.
that, I could do it in the individual level, case by case, or I could try to do it actually in the community level in representing a district. And that's what ultimately kind of led me to the state legislature, and thereafter Congress.
The actor Michael B. Jordan, who played in Just Mercy, reminded me a lot of you when I saw, because of course I'm not privy to the early years of you being a lawyer, but to see how he approached that character reminded me a lot of you in terms of what you just said, just to be able to care and to do just by people. So he reminded me quite a deal on how you was able to do that. Now, let me, the Wall Street Journal came out with something last week. It's all over every newspaper. Nigerian protesters. Nigeria is now the place to talk about based on police brutality. One of the cities that was locked down was Lagos. And it's almost a mirror image, but then again, I don't know how much of it's just a mirror image with here in the States or other countries that we do not know about. I mean, we really don't hear a lot of what goes on in Africa, unless you read the African periodicals, or maybe periodically the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal. What was your response, and what was your take on that when you observed that and was able to read about that?
Yeah, it was, it certainly caught, I think, all of our attention, in terms of, those of us who are serving in Washington and part of the Congressional Black Caucus, where there's been a long history. When the Congressional Black Caucus, which will be 50 years, in existence next
Yeah.
year, we'll be
Yeah.
celebrating our 50th anniversary. When it was first founded in 1971, including by Shirley Chisholm from Brooklyn, they called it the Congressional Black Caucus, not the Congressional African American Caucus. And I think the reason why they called it the Congressional Black Caucus is they realized that we have a responsibility to think about the African diaspora, wherever it's found.
Yeah.
If you're Black in America, Black in the Caribbean, Black in South America, or Black, of course, in the continent of Africa. And, it was, to see, it shows you that part of what we have to do with law enforcement is change the mindset. We can't just change the color, because yes, that helps to have a more diverse police force. And studies have empirically consistently shown here in the States that the more diverse the police force, the less brutal it is. Though you still have Black officers who clearly engage in the same level of brutality, perhaps this learned behavior, as others who are out of control at times. And now we're seeing that, of course, with an all Black force, in Africa. But was that learned behavior? Where did that come from? Does that trace in part to the colonial roots?
Yeah.
of, of what has happened on the African continent. But I think our view has been with the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, fundamentally what we have to do is change the way that our communities are dealt with from a warrior mentality of policing to a guardian mentality. Because if you have a warrior mentality, you view the community as enemy combatants and stuff goes wrong.
Yeah.
If you've got a guardian mentality, then you view us as partners whose public safety should be lifted up. We are people to be cherished, to protect and serve, right? But if you're not governing with or policing with a guardian mentality, you get a problem. So I think what's clear, it reinforced the notion that you got to go beyond diversifying the police force. If you don't change the approach to policing, and if you don't have things in place that hold officers who cross the line accountable, then you'll get it in America, you'll get it in South America, you'll get it in the Caribbean, and you'll get it in Nigeria and Africa.
When you talked about warriors, it almost reminded me in small portion of your wording, it reminded me of Sun Tzu's The Art of War. I mean, that whole warrior, whether they're not acting as warriors or whether they're just inheriting something, it reminded me a lot of that. Now, you talked about voting earlier. My guest tonight, brothers and sisters, ladies and gentlemen, is Congressman Hakeem Jeffries, 8th District. And we're so glad to have him on. Had I known, but of course I don't, things are so different. If there was a cash app, we could send him something, but I don't know how that works. And I want to be careful with that because we wanted to really be a blessing to him. But none of that was given to us. And there's a reason why, and I can understand that too. Now, you talked about voting. What are the things that they should watch out for, voters that is, in terms of what to be conscious of? Like when you're voting, to what to be, not just the president, what to be conscious of while you're looking down that ballot or looking through that ballot?
Yeah, well, two things I would say. Make sure that you vote up and down the ballot and flip it over. And on the back of that ballot, you're going to see judicial candidates. And, we want to make sure that we're putting judges on the bench who share our values. We can all hope that we never find ourselves in their courtroom. But if you do, you're going to hope that they are people who share your values, understand your experiences. So, go down that whole ballot and, at every level of government, and in the even year election, you'll see the race for the president, you'll see Congress, you'll see the state Senate, and you'll see the state assembly. And then when you flip the ballot over, you'll see judges. Now, the other thing I would say is, because we're seeing great turnout now, but we didn't see this level of turnout in the primary.
Right.
And, voting, particularly in a state like New York, is important, not just in the general, but in the primary, because often if you become the Democratic nominee, you are on your way into serving in that office. So if you just wait till the general election to vote, then your voice has not actually been heard in terms of who the Democratic nominee is. In a district, in almost every single congressional district in New York City, with the exception of one, which is the competitive race in Staten Island, which is a 50-50 race because it's a 50-50 kind of district. For the rest of us, if we don't get 90% of the vote in the general election, somebody looking at me, Jeffries, what did you do wrong during the last 2 years? You done messed up.
Yeah.
Because it's so overwhelmingly Democratic. So, right, but in a lot of our communities, the primary is everything. So I think, moving forward, beyond this general election, there will be competitive primaries in June of next year at the municipal level to decide who's going to be the next mayor, who's going to be the next controller, who's going to be your next city council person, who's going to be your district attorney.
Yes.
And don't wait till November to vote. we want everybody to show up in June in the primary. There'll be early voting as well, so that you can put your stamp of approval on whoever is going to be the Democratic nominee in the general election.
That is broad information for us to all to be mindful of. Give us, if you can, Congressman, an insight how this country and the world will be after the election, no matter which way it goes, but after the election.
Yeah, well, I think that we're going to have to find a way to deal with whatever the situation is after the election. It'll be extraordinary if this president gets a second term, but if that's the case, that's the case, and we're going to have to deal with the reality. And as I said, when he prevailed the first time around, that Churchill once said, success is not final, failure is not fatal. All that matters is the courage to continue.
Yeah.
And so regardless of what happens, we got to have the courage to continue. Hopefully, things are going to work out so that we can be in a better place politically. But whatever the case is, we're going to all have to have the courage to continue to fight through this storm. And one of the reasons why we can do it is because we know whoever's sitting at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, the good news is God's still on the throne.
Yeah.
On November 4th. And we have the courage to be able to continue in that regard. That said, I think that a lot of what has happened over the last 4 years and accelerated in the last year, has caused people to say, you know what? Leadership matters, governance matters, who's in office matters. And so it may be the case once we get beyond Trump that we see a level of activity and engagement that will be good, for the community and the city and the country, because the more people who are involved, the better it is in terms of government reflecting the values of the people. You can't have government of the people, by the people, and for the people if the people aren't participating.
Yeah.
And so I think that we will proceed. I think we're going to be successful largely on November 3rd, but whatever the case may be, I learned in the Cornerstone Baptist Church growing up, as you mentioned, a setback is nothing more than a setup for a comeback.
Comeback, yeah.
And so maybe the comeback is complete on November 3rd, maybe it's not, but if it's not, that means we're still on the pathway to the great comeback, which we will achieve one way or the other.
I only have two other things to bring up, Congressman. There are so many New Yorkers who are talking about and making their exit out of New York. They just can't afford it any longer. We already know about gentrification, but the fact that so many people are moving out, and in the moving out, the price of housing to purchase a house, to purchase a co-op or a condominium is going up as they move out. With New York faced with that kind of situation, I know that New York is a different city, more than any other city in the country, but how will that, in a sense, really affect this city, certainly in the near future or present future, I should say?
Yeah, no, Congresswoman Clark, Congressman Meeks, and myself had a meeting yesterday with some in the development community, and we made it clear to them that, listen, we've got to do better. I'll speak for myself. I'm not anti-development. I'm anti-displacement. Now, we can't have development where the community doesn't benefit. And the most significant challenge that we confront, I believe, in our communities and throughout New York City beyond the COVID-19 pandemic is the lack of affordable housing, because the demand for affordable housing so greatly exceeds the supply, and that creates these cost pressures. And when you have a market like that, which is out of balance, then I think we have to step in aggressively at the city, state, and federal level to create affordable housing and to preserve what we have. We can't lose anything that we have. public housing, Mitchell-Lama housing, Section 8 housing, rent stabilized housing. We can't lose anything that we have. And we've made a lot of progress in that regard, including at the state level, where the strongest rent protection laws in the history of the city and the state were passed a year ago. Again, who's in local office matters, but we still have to do so much more because the gentrification pressures are so extreme. But I do think that perhaps the COVID-19 pandemic, which is going to slow down real estate transactions, if we're intentional about really investing in a meaningful way in affordable housing, we have an opportunity to hit the pause button on the gentrification in a way that can be transformative. And that those are part of the conversations that we're having. And also at the federal government level, we're going to pass a big infrastructure bill next year, hopefully during the first 100 days. And what we've said is that infrastructure is both the things that we've traditionally put into that category: bridges, roads, tunnels, airports, mass transportation system. It's also affordable housing. Yeah. And I think we're poised to invest hundreds of billions of dollars into affordable housing at a level that we haven't seen for decades, if we can get this infrastructure bill over the finish line. The House has already passed it. We'll have to repass it again next year. But if we have partners in the Senate and the administration, then help is on the way.
Now, I don't know how libraries are doing currently, Congressman, to be honest at this point. I don't know how they're doing or how they're faring. But it leads me to just ask you this question. What books would you recommend? And I ask this at every guest because, interesting enough, people and particularly members of our congregation are writing the books down.
Yeah.
What books would you recommend for people to read, no matter what that subject is?
Yeah, well, what I would say is that, particularly in this moment where we're trying to deal with, the systemic racism that has been in the soil of America for 401 years, and hopefully make progress in a transformational fashion. When I talk to young activists, I think they've got it right. They say we want to see sustainable change.
Yeah,
we want change, but we also want it to be sustainable. I think that's exactly right. But in order to understand where we need to go, we have to understand why we are where we are. And so the two books that I think are foundational to that journey, one, Eric Williams wrote a book called Capitalism and Slavery. Mm-hmm. And, it lays out sort of the history in a very compelling way of the transatlantic slave trade and how that worked in connection with the dawn of America and, capitalism and the wealth that was created for so many communities to which we were excluded. And I often say, Reconstruction was supposed to get us 40 acres and a mule. What our communities were left with in many instances was 40 ounces and a blunt. And so but capitalism and slavery,
yes, sir.
Right? That provides a good foundation of how we got to the original sin of this country. And then, of course, some of you may have read, but those who haven't, Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow is kind of the bookend to that, right? Okay, out of slavery into Jim Crow, out of Jim Crow into mass incarceration, what she appropriately frames as the new Jim Crow, and how we need to shake that system in order to march toward a more perfect union.
Congressman Jeffries, thank you so much for taking your time and appearing on here. I know probably with your staff, and I don't blame them either, they wanted to know what this was all about. They wanted to make sure that their congressman was not going to be entrapped. And I certainly was not going to do that. I was just going to ask you these basic questions. And you've really been very helpful in many ways. You helped the people who are tuning in. You helped certain members of my congregation who really love you. I mean, my congregation loves you. My family loves you. And I pray much for your future, whatever that will entail. And I pray that God will continue to keep you balanced and your family. and to keep all of you healthy. And that's my prayer for you as you move forward.
Well, Pastor, I appreciate you. I was looking forward to this all week. And, you know, it's just a great forum that God has blessed you with, you know, to reach the people in this fashion. And it was an honor to be able to join you, you know, the Bethlehem Nation and the broader community on tonight's show.
Thank you so much. My guest next week will be Pastor Elder J.D. Williams from the St. John's Baptist Church in Far Rockaway. Certainly tune in to hear this great scholar of the biblical writ. And Elder Williams does have that in his mind and in his spirit. Congressman, love you, man, and I appreciate you.